A moment such as this. Written by Phoenix Rising 819. Read by Arashi. His lance fell in swift retribution, cutting down yet another one of the Empire's servants. Avenge us! Each voice boomed in his mind, cold as ice crystals. Our spilled blood cries for vengeance. Another after another. Dimitri! After another. If you really loved us, you would have avenged us by now. After another. Edelgard. He hated that wretched woman, what she'd done to him, what she was still doing to him even after death. They all looked at him accusingly, their empty stares chilling him to the bone. Their souls still wandered the earth, never able to find peace. His abhorrence of just her name alone was the only flame of warmth he had left to cling to against the cold grip of the dead keep on his heart. Everyone he had ever once loved was dead at the hands of Edelgard. The world he lived in ever since that day had been one endless nightmare from which he was never to be rescued. For every living face, he could only see now the faces of the dead, his family, the innocent people of Dusker, every soldier to have died under his command. Why did you let us die? The whispers sent a shiver down his spine. In fleeting moments of clarity, he could see the true faces of his comrades, his friends of old. Each and every one of them watched him with fear growing in the lights of their eyes now. They had made their best efforts to mask their terror when he was present, but eventually they always faltered in their efforts. Some let slip a glimpse of trepidation as he walked by them. Others, he could smell their fear rolling off them as he drew his weapon against their common enemy. Felix had been right all along. He was no lion among his people. He was a boar prince, an animal, a savage in need of putting down. But he would not die now, not until he had her head. He would remain a monster, if that was the cost, until he could bring peace to his family and his people once more. He was thankful his friends feared him. He wished no one to follow this path with him. It was his and his alone to tread. The soldiers just kept coming in droves with no end in sight. Their numbers hardly mattered to him. Each one was only a step closer to his goal, the demise of their emperor. Most were faces that belonged to strangers, which made the task easier at least. There was a small part of himself that still endured and thoroughly deplored the violence of his actions. If he only met outsiders in battle, he fared a better chance to maintain his resolve. He breathed for this one singular goal, and he would not be deterred. Once it was achieved, he no longer cared what would become of him. In truth, he embraced the hope that in destroying Edelgard, it would cost him his own life in return. In this way, the world would be rid of two monsters instead of just one. He felt the life expel from the soldier before him as he deftly ripped his lance from the fallen corpse. He kept searching the field of battle, hoping to cross with the one he searched for so diligently. If he could at least find something or someone to lead him to her location, so he could strike her head clean from her shoulders and be done with this ceaseless agony. Up ahead, he could see a dark-haired figure weaving spells with ease as he tactfully took out each and every one that dared to come against him, as if their attempts were an insult to his intelligence. Hubert. It had to be him, and where Hubert was, Edelgard was sure to be close by. He hastened his pace, knocking over anybody that stood in his way, friend and foe alike. All were simply obstacles in the way of his true purpose. "Where is Edelgard?" he roared once he was finally within range. Hubert, barely flinching to break his stride, whirled around to face his newest opponent and instinctively blasted him with a magic-infused burst of fire. He barely reacted in time to dodge the attack so precisely dealt to him. The ground that was beneath his feet minutes before was now ash and soot. This was going to be harder than it looked. No matter. He would prevail. His family demanded it be so. "Ah, Dimitri, it's been a while, hasn't it? You truly have fallen from your former glory, haven't you?" Hubert scorned, gaining no rise from his words. He ventured further. "You must take me for a fool if you think I would so easily impart to you the location of my emperor to one such as yourself. If you will not aid me in my quest, then I have no use for you. Prepare to meet your death, you sniveling cur." Dimitri held his lance with the grip of a vice and launched himself forward, the bloodlust burning like wildfire in his chest. He dodged the masterfully crafted attacks hurled in his path as perilously he made his way closer and closer to his enemy. The closer he came, the more he was unable to dodge, so instead he was forced to absorb the blasts as each one rained down upon him, leaving him with the sensation that he'd been ripped open from the inside out. He was a mere arm's breadth away from striking his foe with the full force of Ariadvar when he heard someone scream louder than the dead that were chanting in his ears. "Dimitri, stop!" Byleth. What was she doing here? He was sure she'd been positioned to the other side of the battle at the consequence of his own request when the battle strategy was made. He had wanted her far removed from him, so she couldn't see him or hinder the mission he had to fulfill. "We need him! Alive!" she pleaded from only a few yards away. His hesitation lended him no favors, as he felt the blast of yet another attack hit him, this time sending him sprawling onto the ground. Knowing it would be quite a feat to knock Dimitri off his feet, Byleth rushed the distance to his side to see if he was injured. "Dimitri, are you—" "I'm fine." He refused to look her in the eyes. He couldn't bear it. He couldn't bear the pity she always seemed to harbor with every glance she stole at him. She was the only one to ever look at him unafraid. His teacher. His friend. No, he couldn't afford to feel the way he did about her. She didn't deserve it. What was the love of a monster? A bore, worth to one such as her? No. He would deal swift justice to Edelgard and leave the monastery once his family received the lasting peace they deserved. He would live on his own, where he could no longer hurt anyone anymore, until the day his final breath left him. "It seems your professor still has to clean up after your mess, Dimitri." Hubert gave him a sly grin as he crossed his arms in ridicule. "When are you ever going to grow up, child of Fargus?" He held his fingers aloft, the dark magic energy swirling and sparkling between them. "Get out of here, Professor." Dimitri pulled himself up and stared into the eyes of his sworn opponent, venom lacing his next words. "This one's mine." He took up his lance once again as he made to charge the villain before him. He felt her pull against his shoulder. She was short of stature, but far stronger than anyone would have dared to believe. His anger was boiling, but he would stay his strength long enough to prevent her potential injury. Her touch was enough to halt his course. "We're facing him together." She stared at him, unflinching, with a fire and determination he had only witnessed when watching her defend her friends in battle. He knew her to be as stubborn as himself, so there wasn't much he could do to stop her at this point, without hurting her and giving Hubert the edge he needed to win. A grunt of frustration was all he could muster to reply with. Byleth took up her sword once more, carefully circling Hubert, so he would be forced to split his attention in two different directions of a potential attack at once. "If you think attacking me on both sides will somehow hinder me in crushing the both of you, this is child's play." In an instant, Hubert disappeared before their eyes. Led by instinct, Dimitri twirled around, placing himself back to back with Byleth. He knew he could rely on her to always watch his blind spot in any situation. They had barely the time to get in formation when Hubert suddenly appeared once more, staying just long enough to hurl a gust of magic-laced winds that attempted to dare shake their footing, but gaining minimal success. Seconds later, he was back, this time hurling a blast of firepower enough to singe the ends of their clothing. He continued, relentlessly raining down a range of magically induced attacks, often bringing Dimitri and Byleth to their knees from the weight of the punishment placed upon them if they were not able to dodge in sufficient time. Dimitri couldn't keep track of him, despite his best efforts. Each failure filled him with rage. This was time wasted, energy spent for nothing. If Byleth had stayed on the other side of the battle, as he originally planned, he could have finished off Hubert a long time ago. He was nearing exhaustion while playing this fruitless game of Hubert's. It was time to finish this. As if by a sudden stroke of luck, he saw it. His chance had come at last. Hubert stood but a few feet away, breathless. So it seemed unabated magic did have its price after all. All power required energy, and his was far spent, it seemed. He didn't notice Dmitri was so close, or Dmitri was sure he would have been regaled with more nonsense of how inferior he was to the might of Hubert's magic. Dmitri gripped his one and only true companion in this war, Ariadvar, and with a petrifying war cry, he plunged his weapon straight into his enemy's cold and calculating heart. He ripped the lance from its ennobled residence with a gleeful smile. This would crush Edelgard once she learned her lifelong vassal lay dead, his blood soaking the field even now. His eyes suddenly twitched as his vision began to blur. He pinched the bridge of his nose, trying desperately to blink away the fuzziness growing around him. He opened his eye once more, his vision returning with each passing moment. "Dmitri?" The voice was weak, so very weak. He heard the chuckle a few feet away. But who would laugh at the dead at his feet? His family? Their apparitions all looked at him in silence. He looked down at his feet to behold his fresh kill. There, in a fast-forming pool of blood, lay Byleth. Byleth? But how? She was at his side but a moment ago. Did Hubert deceive him with magic? Or was his bloodlust so great he had mistaken her for the enemy? He looked to his lance, still slick with blood that was on his hands. It was him. He had done this. He could never wash this stain off of him, not if he begged forgiveness for 1,000 years. Oh, goddess above, what had he done? Fear, so sudden in its conception, gripped his heart like a vice. A blood-curdling scream rested at the edge of his lips as the weight of what he'd done descended down upon him with a ferocity unbeheld. It was in the next moment he was awake, fighting for breath. His chest heaved, struggling for purchase of the plenteous air around him. He couldn't breathe. Where was he? What had happened? His hands, no. They were perfectly clean of blood and grime, only calloused from his continued years of training. All around him lay the semi-darkness of another long night. Another dream, then. Each one dealt him the crippling sensation he was in the presence of reality. In each one, he was a murderer. He knew to wake each night, drenched in terror and sweat, was a punishment far lighter than he deserved. Shame rested on him like a leaden and oppressive blanket. He rolled his neck around, working out the tension as best he could. His breath came still in ragged bouts, but it was slowing down to a normal pace again. There was no way he was sleeping now, at least not for a while. Carefully, he got out of bed and reached for his eye patch to cover the abyss that lingered where his right eye once was. Only one scar of many that endured as a constant reminder of what lengths he had been willing to go to in the name of vengeance. Not many people had ever seen him without it, and even though it was still dark out, he didn't wish to frighten anyone. Not anymore. The chill of the night air clung to him more fiercely now that his shirt was doused in a cold sweat. He didn't even bother to change. What was the point? If he did manage to sleep once again, doubtless he would awaken once more in a similar fashion. He pulled an azure-colored jacket from a nearby chair, one he had so carelessly tossed aside after training only hours earlier. He wasn't warm, but he was no longer shivering at least. He slipped out of his dark and spacious room and made his way to where he always did, the balcony overlooking Ferdiad. This time, he decided to take the long route. He had always tried his best to never take the same path twice during his nighttime ramblings. He didn't wish for the entire castle to know how restless his mind was every night, although he was sure almost everyone knew already. He had encountered many of the notoriously loose-lipped maids and servants retiring to bed just as he was beginning yet another round of sleeplessness. Rumors and gossip were always sure to grow and spread any time a large amount of people were amassed together in any location. Despite knowing his tactics to be surely in vain, he took pleasure simply in the act of moving. It was one of the few ways he knew to keep his uneasy heart still. Each guard he passed gave him a small, curt nod, a silent promise to not tell anyone of his whereabouts. They had all witnessed him, night after night, but none had dared to intrude upon his privacy. He appreciated their silent vow of secrecy more than he could ever hope to say. He swung open the double doors leading out to the balcony where before him lay an entire kingdom dependent upon his every governing command. He had been in a position of authority nearly his entire life. He had always known he would become king if he ever lived long enough to ascend the throne, but this was so much more command than he had ever held in the past. At merely his word, he could send the entire sleeping town below him into a frenzy to do his bidding. The thought made him shudder. He didn't think any one man or woman had the right to dictate the lives of thousands. War had made him sick of heart and mind. No one should be exclusively at the mercy of one that stood a chance to fall to such depths. 5 years had passed since he last took up his lance in the name of a cause. He prayed he may never be called to do so again. The kingdom below lay peacefully dreaming as he, their once wayward son, gazed upon the sleepy village, glad for the newfound peace secured for his people. He breathed in deep, cold night air and let the chill slow the tendrils of anxiety from weaving its way inside of him. It was still there, gnawing at him little by little. Little else could be done at this hour without him branding someone else with the loss of sleep equivalent to his own. No, he'd troubled everyone enough in the past. He would no longer burden anyone else with his worries, so long as he could manage his problems on his own. Trouble sleeping? He smiled to himself at the sound of a voice behind him. He didn't even offer to turn around as he released a quiet sigh. He could traverse soundlessly through the entirety of the castle grounds without so much as disturbing even one of the many feline friends that had taken up residence at the castle since their arrival. But her? He could never get anything past her. He barely registered the soft patter of her bare feet against the smooth stone floor as she came to stand beside him, her hand rubbing his back in a soothing motion. Just to feel her touch brought him a trembling sensation of peace, far more tranquility than he dared hope to deserve. I thought surely this time I had slipped away without disturbing you, but alas, I have failed once again, I see. He took her hand, so delicate and warm, in his own. You look so serene in your sleep. I hated the thought of waking you. He kissed the soft flesh of the dorsum of her hand, as feeble offering for the gift of her presence. We've been together 5 years now, Dimitri. There's not a night that passes in which you can sleep fully until the sun's rising. She cradled his face with her remaining hand, stroking his face gently as if she could wipe away all the worry and pain he still bore. In truth, her gesture came close to its intended goal, but nothing so deeply rooted as this could fade with a simple touch. And every night, you always seemed to find me. He smiled at the memories. Once I was fool enough to believe it was because the worries you carried chased away the pleasantries of sleep as they do for me still. But now I am not so sure. Tell me, my beloved, why have you haunted these halls alongside me all these many years? She blushed under his watchful gaze. What light that was present danced brightly in the reflection of his azure-colored eye. His golden hair still hung somewhat in the way of his vision, as it once had years ago, but he had shorn off the long locks he had once possessed. It had been a bit like shedding off a layer of the man he'd once been, and no longer wished to remain. I didn't want you to be alone. She paused. Then the words came faster. All those years since what happened in Dusker, you had pushed away what friends and family you had left. You never let them know the true depths of how you felt. I thought perhaps it was in part because no one dared to ask, since you were considered to be a higher estate. I wanted to be a refuge in your darkest times, when no one else would think to come to your aid. She continued, I just wish I could find some way to bring you true peace after all this time. That's all. The half-smile she gave warmed him more than any fireplace in the entire castle ever had. Unsure of what to say, they both remained silent, gazing out into the cold night as the moon cast down an ethereal light over the world beneath them. Its power was soon fading as the early cusp of dawn was looming, but a short time away. He could feel her lean into him as they stood together, drinking in the wonder of the world at their feet. He looked down to see her resting against his chest, her eyes half closed in sleep, tendrils of mint-colored hair dancing in the gentle breeze. Goddess above, how had he managed to ever be graced with her loving affection? The very first day he'd met her, he felt a tugging at his heart. Something so very human encompassed him, a sensation he thought to be impossible after experiencing so much loss. Her beauty and grace in battle alone had smitten him long before he would be granted the privilege to know her so intimately. He had secretly hoped she would choose to join his house, and even more in awe of the fact that she actually did. As he got to know her in those early days, he realized how much alike they were, and how persistently different, like two sides of the same coin. He had desired all the more that they had encountered each other in a time of peace, when his heart had been whole and he could have been the man she truly believed him to be. He knew he had to keep his distance, or she would learn his awful secret. But every invitation to tea, every meal they shared, every chance at a simple conversation in quiet, he could never bring himself to say no. But when Edelgard revealed herself at last, he could no longer keep in check his feral desires for revenge. On that day, 10 years ago now, he lost both of the defining women of his young adult life. Byleth, the woman he loved, and Edelgard, the woman he loathed with all of his being, slipped once more from his grasp. Those 5 years he courted Byleth's absence. Those years were nothing in his memory now but shadow and darkness. They were broken lances, splintered shields, and hands soaked in blood, each day darker than the one before it, until, as if by a miracle, she appeared, this beautiful creature resting now in his arms. Had she never returned to him, he knew for sure his madness would have stretched on, endlessly, until one was found, strong enough to put him down like the rabid dog he was. But she had never treated him like that. Not once in the time they were together. She scolded him, berated him as was his due, but not once did she ever treat him as anything less than human. Her kindness to him truly knew no bounds, and for that he would remain forever grateful. How he had ever worked up the nerve to even attempt to ask for her hand in marriage, he still wasn't quite sure. He knew this errand was that of a fool's. To even entertain the thought that she would want him by her side the way he desired her, he had fully braced himself to be sent away in that moment, but he simply could not deter his heart's desire to be spoken aloud. And because of it, here she was now, desiring to lose a bit of sleep just to be with him through his darkest moments of the night. She had never asked him about his dreams in the whole of their time together. Some things are too hard to speak aloud, she had said when he had asked her once why she had never been curious enough to pry into the reason for his continued insomnia. She had been right. Some nights he couldn't bring himself to even utter the words, but other time the words were ready to pour from within. She had chosen to share her life with him. The ring glinting on her finger was constant reflection of that choice. He felt he owed it to her to at least try, even if it was just for tonight. The nightmare. It was about you. She twisted in his arms, large green eyes turning to peer into his. What happened? She asked, her stare curious and intent. He shielded away from her look and focused instead on a damaged corner of the floor, garnered from some past war, no doubt. Do you remember when we fought Hubert in the Battle of Grounder? Yes, Her intake of breath was sharp. Oh, I see. She stood still, her eyes downcast, as if pondering her next words carefully. But I was fine overall. Hubert's illusion stood taller than me, so your lance fell nowhere vital. Ash's arrow deferred Hubert from being able to attack, and Mercedes was not far, so she was able to completely heal me with relative ease. She massaged the wound as she relived the moments of its delivery once more. Well, for the most part, it still aches from time to time, but so does 1,000 other scars from 100 other battles. And for that grievance, I will always bear some measure of guilt. But in that moment, I knew in my heart I had killed you. In my quest to avenge the ones I loved, I had killed the one I love. It plagues me still to think how close I came to losing you and this life we now share together. But you didn't. She took his head in her hands and drew him closer to her. I'm right here, and goddess willing, I always will be. She pulled him into her kiss, her lips touching his sorrow and driving back the dark like the sun dawning after a long, stormy night. He clung to her so fiercely, so tenderly, afraid that this was secretly some divine dream that would melt from view the moment he opened his remaining eye. But when at last she relented long enough to give them both some air, he reluctantly opened his eye, fearful he would be haunted once more. Yet she remained, glowing in the pre-dawn light rising behind her. He smiled fully, brightly, a first in many days. His joy seemed to elate her to full brilliance. She took his hands in hers and guided him to one of the nearby couches to sit as they watched the sun rise together, resting in each other's embraces. As she lazed in the crook of his arm, he whispered quietly a sweet "thank you" to dance in her ear as she slowly drifted into a deeper sleep. The sunrises of Vargas had always been a favorite thing of wonder to behold for Dmitri. They always reminded him that there was still hope left for anyone, even him. Even in a place as piercingly cold as this, there was still slivers of warmth to be found. He didn't expect to be released from his nightmares in the space of one night, or even 100. It was a punishment, well earned and deserved. But he had hope that one day, with Byleth at his side, he would have peace again, even if it came only in a handful of moments such as this. He closed his eye, feeling the traces of early sunlight touching his face in a gentle caress. It was there, within hope reborn inside his heart once more, and his greatest treasure in his arms. He fell asleep.